Welcome to Crossroads and Cauldrons. We are two witches with jobs, families, and busy lives just like you. We talk about weaving the web of community, practicing magic, and life in the Deep South. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Crossroads and Cauldrons. I am your host, Selena, and I have one of my favorite people on the show today as a guest. So we've already had him on the show once before. So if you want to go back and get some of his backstory and some more information about his organization, his name is Christopher Penczak, and that is episode 27 on this podcast. So go back and listen to that if you don't know who this is. But otherwise, welcome, Christopher, to the show. It's so wonderful to have you back.
It is so great to be back. Thank you for having me. And I have a little correction for us.
Oh, okay.
Our organization.
Our organization. You're right. You're right. You're right. Thank you. Yes. So yeah, this is where okay, let me start again with words. Christopher is my teacher. So he is the founder, one of the three founders of the Temple of Witchcraft. So this is where I did all of my mystery school training. You hear me talk about it a lot on the show. But here we have Christopher with us. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm getting through tax season, you know, the way of the world right now.
Yes. We didn't have to bring that up right away.
No, really crazy. It's what's on my mind. You asked me how I was doing. Always honest answers, right?
That's true. Well, I hope that you get through it. Well, I hope we all survive it.
I hope we all survive it too. I'm sure we will.
We must. That's our only option. So, wonderful. So I want to jump right in about, my revisit to the Inner Temple. I'm going to turn this around. So this is your big release that's come out recently. You have a few others. We're going to talk about those as well. But the Inner Temple of Witchcraft, this is the 20th anniversary edition. And I have to say that it's beautiful and it's a hardback. And look how fat it is. It's like super meaty. So I can't wait until the later books come. You'll have to put a strap on them or something so people can carry them around. But
carrying case or something. I could see that.
Right. There you go. It matches. It's got the logo on it. Be perfect. Yeah. So this book was instrumental in developing my practice. I had been practicing for a while, just kind of in a scattered way, you know, following wherever my interest took me. I would go there, but I didn't have a real foundation, and I didn't have a clear direction, you know, of what comes next. And I think that's a big question for a lot of people is, okay, now what, you know? So this really, really changed the way I practice the Inner Temple of Witchcraft. And, you know, that was a decade or so ago. And I have to say, I was worried a little bit when you announced that we were going to have these expanded editions, partially because when you take the class, there's a lot of additional materials and rituals and things for students as part of the class and as part of the community, you know, some of the culture that goes along with that. So I was worried at first that it was just going to sort of include all of that stuff, but it really didn't. I was so pleased because it really just revisited a lot of those ideas and sort of brought a lot more depth to them. So my question is, how did you, when you started this project of essentially rewriting these books, revisiting all these ideas, how did you approach that process? What was your goal that you wanted to achieve with reworking these books?
Well, since they've always been textbooks, and it's funny, before the book was ever published, they started with these little 3-ring binders of notes. And there's a generation of temple people who are like, I had it when I had it with the binders, you know, and every class, the binders would get a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. And then you put out the book and they can no longer get bigger because there's the book, right? And then we started doing things online. And as you know, we created the Book of Shadows for the classes. That's for the temple community. And we started doing the wisdom lectures. And I just keep notes of like, whenever I read a book, whenever I have an idea, whenever I write an article, if I think it can fit in someplace else, I'll just make a note of it. So I had these kind of extended files of like dream revision, if I could, you know, redo parts of the book, or if I could add things. Because I didn't really want to rewrite the book completely, because I think it's a core, you know, this is what the book is. You know, if you want to write a different book, write a different book. But I really wanted to add things or flesh things out. You know, you and I have talked before about how I send the recordings out, you know, every year, and the new recordings, you're like, oh, I really like how you mentioned it this way, or, you know, this had a different type of depth, and I can do that in the recordings, but how could I do that in the books? So I tried to make little notes of insights I had or really good questions people had. And a lot of it actually came from the wisdom lectures, because a lot of the wisdom lectures are basically just little essays, sometimes really just short paragraphs of questions people have had or things I've read in a book, and I'll take a quote and ask, you know, what does this mean to you? A little bit of the culture kind of came in, but I'm actually saving that for doing a kind of a Book of Shadows primer to kind of give people a one book that gives them an insight to the culture of the community, but also saving the core Book of Shadows for just the community. Might even be a book, but the book might just be for the community, but figuring that out. So it was really just kind of trying to figure out where to fit those things in. So this book was harder than the ones that are coming up because I think my editor and I didn't really have the process worked out the same way. But in essence of what we do is she gives me a file of all the edited text from the original release. And we kind of do it as a Word file that's like mark changes. And I'll go back in and give it a different edit, and she'll give it a different edit, and we'll just kind of update different terminology. And we've changed some gender things to use more plural pronouns in different places, and that kind of modernization of language. And then I would just kind of drop in different sections that fit in the different lessons. And sometimes she'd tell me, hey, that doesn't fit here. Or other times she'd be like, let's move this over here. Or can you expand this? And so bits of it were from the practices and from the classes, and just, what would I want to convey that maybe people don't always pick up if they just read the book. And so that's how the process went. So we just kind of dropped things into the files, and then they got reformatted and put forward. And that's why each book probably has, including the new forwards and the introductions, but on top of all that, probably about 20,000 words extra.
I really enjoyed it because I've been teaching this class for a few years now, like 5 years now. And for me, a lot of the things that I would address in class or say, well, that was written 20 years ago. So these are how the ideas have evolved over that 20-year time. Things like that are addressed in this book. So that is really exciting for me as someone who's teaching material from this book, because that's in there. So now we can take those ideas and go deeper, because they're going to have that understanding just from reading the material. So I'm excited about that. How has how's the material grown for you over, 20 years of teaching it? It kind of got, like you mentioned before, fixed. Once you write it down and publish it, it's fixed. So how has that grown for you over teaching the material?
Well, I would say even though the text is fixed, the classes are a living experience. And so every time you teach it is a bit different. And now we're even like, the challenge is the modern age of like teaching it on Zoom. So I'm going to be, although we've always had the recordings for distant students, this year coming up is going to be the first time we're going to do Witchcraft 1 live on Zoom. You don't have to attend if you don't want to, but I'm going to gear the materials with the assumption that you're strictly online. Before, we always used to do the idea that, you're getting a sneak preview into what it's like to be in a live class, even if you can't be in a live class. But now you could be in a live class, just be online, so we're trying to adapt with that. But I would say one of the real significant shifts that really showed me how much things have changed since the book came out was the first time I taught it live here at the Temple of Witchcraft in Salem, New Hampshire. So we have all the gardens that are here, and we have all these magical herbs growing, and we've got little sacred spots here and there that are easily accessible. And so for parts of the last class in person for Witchcraft 1, I would take them outside, and I adapted some of the rituals, like the aura cleansing lesson. We actually made a big water, kind of floral water of all these fresh herbs, because the class ended up in the summer, like it was in July. And so we made this kind of floral water, and we did this water blessing to purify the auras, and then did the aura meditation. So it was just interesting of how living it was, but like that can't translate to an online class, and it doesn't necessarily translate to the book, because who's going to know what's going to be bloom at the time when you do that lesson? You have to kind of give things a little bit more succinctly of what's available to people. But it's always been living. And I realize, like, every time I teach the class, I change the syllabus that I teach off of, because there's like the official syllabus in the classes that's just the topics. But the syllabus I teach off of, and where I want to take breaks and where I want to put the exercises, changes every time. Like when I prep for the classes, it always changes. So it's really this kind of living experience of my own growth, of the environment, of what the people bring to it. When I'm teaching it, and my own practice of it too, because these are all exercises I still go back to. I still visit the inner temple regularly. I still do the aura cleansing. I still do all of that.
I've had experience with both of you. Talk about the original classes online, which is where I studied, and it was like that. It was like a little sneak peek into the in-person experience, but you're also removed from it as well. So and since COVID, I've had the experience of being present in class, even though it's via Zoom, and that is a different experience. So I'm excited for your upcoming distance students to have that experience. I think before we had to work online in that way, I don't know if it's something that everyone was exploring deeply.
Right.
And of course, thinking about occult mechanics, there's no reason it can't work. But I think experiencing it and learning how to tweak that and how to work in those types of spaces has really opened up part of my practice that I hadn't considered before. So I'm really excited that other people are going to get to continue to experience that moving forward. What's my next question? So the Outer Temple is the one that's coming out next.
That's right.
When is that one releasing?
I have to get the final edits hopefully this week.
Oh,
So
wow.
sometime soon after that, and then we're jumping right into the third book.
Oh, goodness.
I have
You're going
no
to be
break in
busy.
between. Yeah, I have no break in between. But it's so far like it's just very basic stuff I have to do on the Outer Temple, and it should be out soon.
Wonderful, wonderful. So this episode is probably going to come out at the end of the summer, so that may already be out. If it is, go get it. I can't talk about it, but I'm sure it's just as good as the original Outer Temple, so go get it. I have noticed that some of the projects that you're working on seem to have sort of gone full circle. At least in my experience with working with you, we've covered this broad range of experience, and it seems like we've kind of gone back around and are diving more deeply into a variety of topics. But do you find that that because I think a lot of it comes from your personal experience and your personal gnosis. Do you find that you're able to present that and having a universal sort of application of experience with that, or that you have to kind of adjust it heavily to fit a broader audience? Like, what's leading you to these deeper dives on specific things that you're sharing?
I feel like I've been pretty successful, if I do say so myself, of the wider success and the broader market, and the introductory books, and to be really present. I think those things are still very important, but I've been doing that for over 20 years. And so now I'm really interested in deepening witchcraft culture, deepening metaphysical thought, deepening the art of things, deepening our community in the Temple of Witchcraft, but also just kind of deepening the conversation all around in magic. So that's really where a lot of my focus has been. And I sort of take the view of I'm sharing my experience, and I feel like it's a contacted magical experience, and people can either groove and align with that, or it might inspire them to do their own and something different. And either of those are a success for me, as long as everyone's trying to go deeper on some level. So for me, I'm looking less. Sometimes someone said to me recently about, well, they were looking for something that was more broad that could fit, their background, because they do this, 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 and this. And I was like, well, you can fit it however you'd like, but I'm just sharing with you what I'm doing here, and what the context of that is, in this work. I feel like it gets to sort of a weird place, not bad, but weird, where I feel like, if you don't have the context of my other work, it's all there for you if you want to explore it. But I'm not going to start every class with, oh, this is what witchcraft is to me, and this is what paganism is to me. And, I assume that there's a baseline understanding, or you have your own understanding of that, and your understanding doesn't have to be mine. But really kind of getting into that deeper art and that deeper culture. I look at the beauty of a lot of world traditions, from Tibetan Buddhism and the Tantra that's found in Buddhism and Hinduism, to even some of the folk magic and the mysticism of Christianity. And I have a love-hate relationship with that world from my previous Catholic background. And I look at a lot of witchcraft, and one of the things that I have noticed for a lot of people, and I experienced myself, is that, and today it's much better because there's so much more available, and I'm hoping I'm adding to that availability, but there was a time 10, 15, 20 years ago where there was so little available, and you sort of hit the wall. Like once you did the Wheel of the Year for a few years and you did all the moons and you worked with the god and goddess and you had an understanding of the elements, there wasn't anything that really helped you go deeper. Not that you couldn't go deeper on your own, but there wasn't a lot of signposts for it. There wasn't a lot of contacted art or poetry or mystical writings in the way that, you know, you could find that inspiration in Buddhism and Christian mysticism and Jewish mysticism and all that. And not to say those traditions are better or worse than witchcraft, but modern witchcraft is so much younger, you know, so it's trying to figure out how can we add to that conversation. And I sort of always take the view of like, what really is working for people is going to stick, and what doesn't might be fun in the moment and could fade away, and that's okay too. I don't have to have every idea stick. But if that inspires something else, whether it be in myself or somebody else, then I think it's succeeded.
Well, I'm really glad you're doing that because, well, it just makes it easy for me. But you've kind of opened doors for me that I wouldn't necessarily have explored, or maybe at this time. So I'm glad you're doing it, and keep doing it. I have another question too, sort of on a similar vein. A lot of your writing, and not all of it, you're very academic, and a lot of your writing and your approach is very experiential. Like, here's the thing, play with it, see what happens, which I love. But a lot of things that you've put out lately and that are coming have a lot more of the mythic themes. So how has your practice evolved over the last few years that we're sort of stepping away from it has to make sense to here's the mythic truth that's running through all of this?
Well, I think I'm always looking for, as an occultist, the glorified, unified field of everything. You know, I want that answer that makes sense for everything and puts all the parts of everything that we study together. And I don't think that's going to be logical. You know, I think you can get all the pieces together, but you can't, like in a mosaic, what's the stuff that sticks them together? And I think that's the creative, that's the artistic, that's the mystical, and trying to figure out what our stories are, you know, in the context of the metaphysics. I feel like I was handed, in a good way, I'm not complaining about this at all, but I feel like I was handed by my teachers a bit of a jumble. And I think a lot of people feel that way at different times. Like there's a lot of disparate parts that all work and can all work together, but you don't always know what the context of they are in our lives, mythically, magically, morally. You know, how do we see it as a cohesive whole? And I think story is one of those ways that we start to make things make more sense. Because a story is just a story. It's not, you know, universal truth. You're not saying this is the academic history. I think if you practice this long enough, you know, people get really robust about this is the history as it is now, and this is how it has to be, and we were wrong with these other books. And then you wait 10 years and people are like, no, actually it's this, and that was wrong. And then you wait another 10 years and there's some other thing coming out. And I think that's great. And I think anything that kind of evolves it, but I think, you know, there's literal truths and there's mythic truths. And I think sometimes witchcraft today has gotten so focused on the literal truth because things that we thought were literal truths were mythic truths, and we sort of felt betrayed by them. You know, a lot of us kind of came about in the time of, you know, the great witch cult. And we talked about how this is a pre-Christian tradition that survived all these centuries. And this was the Book of Shadows for it. And yes, it's changed, but, you know, this is some link to it. And I think there's great mythic truth to that, because I feel like we are connected to those ancient witches. But I don't think you can trace an academic line to the Gardnerian Book of Shadows to the pre-Stone Age people. But that was sort of the story I was told, you know, and at the time I didn't know any better, so it made sense. And I was like, oh, that's great, I'm part of this big thing. I think we're almost sort of disenchanting some of our own magic by saying, oh, that's not real, oh, this was bullshit, oh, that, you know, can't be done. And we have to kind of separate the mythic truth from the academic truth. So I'm all for, here's the academic, you know, argument of this is connected to that, and we can't prove this link, but we think linguistically this might have something to do with it. But also, you know, looking at that mythic truth of how we're all connected. I have such admiration for like the Tibetan Buddhists who can study simultaneously the transmission of Buddhism from India across the Asian continent and to Tibet and how it came there, and have names and dates and all that type of stuff, but also can tell the tale of how Tibet was founded by a great bodhisattva. And Buddhism has always been in Tibet from the beginning. And well, which is true. You know, if you know that it was imported, then that can't be true, but it's true mythically, it's true magically. And I think we haven't quite figured out how to hold those two truths. And so I feel like a lot of my work is about, how can we see this story and not be attached to the story as the truth, but have that story be a truth? Can it tell us something? Can it share something? Can it kind of put the pieces in place? So I feel like a lot of my work, particularly, and I feel like I have the mandate, I guess, to do it in the Temple of Witchcraft because, it's a lot of the teachings I've shared. Now, if I want to share a different context for them, this is what's worked for me. And I hope other people will be like, oh, that doesn't work for me, but this is what works for me, and share it through their rituals and share it through their teachings. But I think they also have to have that sense of, well, someone's sharing it in this way, so it's okay to put it together with story. It's okay to put it together with myth. And my myths might be different than Christopher's myths, and that's cool too. And, we can, when you look at like ancient Egypt, none of the creation myths match, but they all can be true at different points, at different temples, at different rituals. So there's not a need to invalidate anyone else's story or myth to make context. It's just that's the lens of context at that moment. And that's been on my mind a lot lately. And I think when the temple started, those were the questions I was asking. And I think I'm finally getting things now through the experience in the community to say, these are some of my answers, or these are some of the things I want to share as potential answers, and see how it comes out.
I'm really glad you're doing that, because I feel like that's something that, as modern practitioners, is missing. Is sort of and I don't want to say overarching, but any semblance of a culture, and it can be, like you said, within a particular framework, like within our tradition. These are our mythic threads that sort of connect everything together, and however you relate to those, that's your link in that chain. But we've spent so much time trying to prove that magic is real, and that these techniques work, and that these experiences are valuable, and that no, we're not, we are real. Like, I get a lot of questions from people saying, you're a witch, is that even real? I'm right here, I can hear you, but we don't have story. We don't have oral traditions that are passed on to us. We don't have creation stories that sort of speak to our soul and our experience. We don't need them to be literal, but I think a lot of people miss that, because we've had to try to prove that our experiences are valid. So I think we've pushed ourselves away from anything that seems absurd or over the top or mythical, and I think that we've done ourselves a disservice in that. So I'm delighted to see you working to develop that culture and that mythos that we can carry on through our tradition. And I hope that other traditions are doing the same. So keep doing that. Keep sharing. I love it. Let's see. What was my next question? So that leads us to The Witch's Hut, which came out recently. And it's sort of along those same lines of a parable of story, of teaching a lot of the things that are actually reviewed in the Temple of Witchcraft series are in the Witch's Hut, but told through story. So what do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. The Witch's Hut kind of came out really through my struggle in trying to understand some of my own experiences with conflict, actually. I was having the nut of it kind of came through, the little seed kernel of it came through when I was having conflict with somebody. And really just kind of thinking about the aspects of the outsider. We're a tradition and a community of outsiders trying to gather together, but we're still on the outside to the greater community, and we're always sometimes on the outside to each other. And just that whole othering that we go through, and it's hard when you have conflict not to other somebody and or not to feel othered. And sometimes that's helpful, because sometimes that's where the witch's power comes from. Sometimes I don't want to be a part of greater society. Sometimes there's a freedom to move however I want to move and not care how people think, but sometimes not. So in that kind of came through this voice, and it wasn't channeled or it wasn't a spirit contact, but it was just a little inspiration of like, if I had to explain this to somebody, how would I explain it? This sort of story of the witch in the hut, and there's a great calamity that happens in the village, and they all blame the witch, and they end up in this great rainstorm at her doorstep, wanting to basically string her up and take her away. And she's like, hold on. And she, sort of explains them placing blame. And she sort of explains, some basic mechanics of metaphysics from witchcraft perspective. But kind of to the layman. I've always wanted to teach. I'm not a great fiction writer in the sense of doing novels and stories in that way, but maybe someday, who knows? But I always thought that's such a great way to teach. I think I've spent so much of my life creating textbooks. And some people really gravitate towards that, but there's always a segment of the community that wants to sit by the fire and get the story. And me too, I wish I had that too, but I didn't. So I have to sort of figure out, how do I transmit that? And particularly in this day and age, could a book, a parable, a story do that? And I think of some of my favorite spiritual books are parables in that way. And, a huge nod, not that I say it's in any way comparable, but a huge nod to Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. That was one of my favorite books. It was one of my mother's favorite books. I read it every year on the anniversary of her death as kind of an homage to her, and that kind of giving advice, the prophet giving advice in different context, but that always gave me lessons that stuck with me. So I was like, well, how would that work in a witchcraft context? And it took me many years to write this book for such a short book. Like, little pieces would fall through, particularly when I was having conflicts with people. And I would just kind of get this inspiration, and then the conflict would resolve, and then the book would go away. So it took many a year to get it done, but I'm very happy with the way it came out, even though it's such an unusual book for me.
I like it. I hope you continue to do to put those out there. I read it in one go. I would say one sitting, but I was in the bathtub. I read in the bathtub because I have children and they will find me otherwise. But I read it in one evening until the water was frozen. And I was just like, yes, I love this. So if you haven't explored the witch's hut, please do that. And that brings me to another question that might be kind of a big question. And I don't know. Let's talk a little bit about the witch soul. A lot of your work lately, particularly in classes, if you're a part of the community, and I'm sure that a lot of my listeners are part of the temple community, but talk to me a little bit about the witch soul. What is the work of, what is that to you, and what is the work of developing a relationship with that?
Well, it's something that kind of come out through the evolving of the high priestess, high priest initiation ceremonies in the temple. So the first place I write about it is in the Living Temple of Witchcraft series. And it's this idea of the energy, the consciousness of witchcraft. There's a great poem that was put out by Jack Parsons. I don't know if people are familiar with it. It was probably my first introduction to just the wording of it. I guess he wasn't really specifically talking about the witch soul, but he talked about the phrase of it started out with, "We are the witchcraft." It wasn't "we are witches." It wasn't, we are witches gathered together. It wasn't "we practice witchcraft." It was like, "We are the witchcraft." And that always struck with me. And if you're not familiar with that poem, I recommend the listeners to go check that out. You can find it online, "We are the witchcraft." Another place that some of it came through is through the controversial traditional craft magician and witch Andrew Chumley. He writes a lot about the one sorcerer. That sort of evolved into our traditions and the poetry just spontaneously as things come out when you're in ritual and speak. The one sorcerer is the first witch, the last witch, and all witches in between. And kind of taking a nod from the Dion Fortune work when she talks about past lives and incarnations, that each of our lives is like a bead upon a strand and a necklace, and the true sense of self is the cord that runs through it. And kind of applying that idea not just to your soul and to your individual existences and incarnations, but the essence of being the witchcraft. What is that? Is there a consciousness to it? Getting back to those other traditions we just were talking about, the idea that modern metaphysics will often talk about things like Christ consciousness, or Buddhism will talk about the idea that we all have an inherent Buddha nature. And what is that for witchcraft? And I'd say my best answer to that is I don't know, but I'm exploring it. So this concept that it's like the soul of the world, but we often think of the soul of the world as strictly the goddess, the cosmic goddess, or the star goddess, or Hecate, or whatever name you want to put to it. And it's not quite that, but it's related to that. What is the animating consciousness of witchcraft? Not just magic, but what is it? The mystery of what it is to be a witch. What is the mystery to be practicing witchcraft? What is that animating consciousness? And I think of that as the witch soul. And the witch soul has expression in every witch that ever has been, ever was, and ever will be. And we've gotten to some really kind of amazing and crazy discussions of like, is there witches on other planets? Are there witches in other dimensions? I think so. But what does that look like? I don't know. But I think it's not just restricted to planet Earth, although I think Earth has a particular expression of the witchcraft and the witch soul. I think it's related a lot on Earth to our concept in the temple of the three rays, of the sorcerer, of the first witch, the last witch upon planet Earth, which in many ways planet Earth is, a witch. That idea of the cauldron of transformation and the ability of the elements and transformation and the divine feminine, all of that kind of wrapped up into the planetary being. So I think that's part of the mystery of trying to figure out what is it that unites us? What is it that's inherent about our nature? What would be the equivalent of our Buddha nature or Christ consciousness, or, as other religions evolve, and I might not be familiar with their terms. Those are the two that I'm most familiar with. And I think back to another controversial author who in no way am I endorsing, but I'm just quoting correctly, Florida Donner. In her book, The Witch's Dream, she often talks about, and I'm paraphrasing, I think, there's a little bit of witch in everyone. There's a little bit of witch in each of us. And I believe that's true to a certain extent. I've always been a believer that who's a witch and who isn't a witch is between you and the gods, between you and your soul, between you and your spirits. I think like recognizes like. So there's people I recognize as witches, and others I might be like, oh, that doesn't feel like the same thing to me. But who am I to say? They might be in a different practice of it. I don't necessarily believe you have to be endorsed by a particular person or tradition to be a witch. I think it's something inherent to us. But I think the traditions I'm practicing happen to come from the Western occult tradition, so that's how I perceive it. But yeah, I think it's about that inherent nature of what it is to be witchcraft, what it is to be that type of magical, what it is to kind of carry that consciousness, because it carries a lot of paradoxes. It carries a lot of kind of inner conflict, the outsider, the insider, the in the world and out of the world, between the worlds. All of that's a rich complex we're all kind of carrying around. So what can we use magically and ritually and mystically to kind of unite us, but also to recognize the differences?
I really like that that description of it, and in my own work, I have found that it goes beyond just the material world as well. There's an aspect of it that exists on this, just like we have an aspect of ourselves, I suppose, that exists on, in other spiritual realms. We talk about when working with spirits and things like that, the ones that are sort of keen to work with us tend to be doing the same work that we're doing
Right.
on the other side, so they're witches from the way we would perceive them on the other side, which is why they want to work with us, just like we want to work with them. And I have seen threads of that witch soul on that side as well, which expands sort of my understanding of what that is. Because I initially thought of it as that animating sort of life force, and it's really been pared down to be a specific thing, a specific thread of consciousness, although very expansive. But it is a specific thing, and I do believe that everyone has psychic ability, and we have the ability to awaken the magic within ourselves. But I don't believe that everyone is drawn to that or called to that or even interested in that at all. And I think that's where we see the witch soul. And I think that's where we get ideas of, the goddess chooses her people and those sorts of things, because that thread is activated. I guess it's like kind of like genetics. You have things that are in there, but maybe they're not activated.
A lot of the Buddhists talk about seeds like being good and bad seeds being awakened. So it's like we have all these potentials within our garden, but what seeds get watered and what seeds don't, I think that's a part of it too. I think you might have the potential for it, but a lot of people don't want to water that witchcraft strain. Just like I think you and I might have the potential to be really great, unconditional loving Christians, but that's not my paradigm of how where I want to put my energy, where I want to put my water. It's just not the viewpoint. Not that I don't think unconditional love is important, but the Christos principle is not what activates me, But I think that's different than the witch soul principle. I think they might ultimately are both beneficial, but I think they're both different things.
That brings me to, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's an excellent segue. You're so good at segues. I have to just put that in your resume as like your superpower, the power of the segue. So I recently have had, okay, let me make my words get into some sort of order. Okay, the last several years have been highly difficult just to exist on the planet. There's just been a lot of conflict and breakdown of communication just in a million different areas. And for a lot of people that are experiencing more discrimination, more fear, they're being triggered in a lot of ways. it has been a challenge to sort of remember my oath is to the great work, and everything serves in its time, and to sort of hold compassion when I really want to just punch somebody in the face. And I'm seeing a lot of people are sort of slipping away from that, and people are really getting into their anger and wanting to be combative with each other rather than opening communication. And let's talk a little bit about the great work and about how people what is that to you? For me, that work is elevating human consciousness in particular, because that's the body I'm in right now. That's my experience. Bringing mindfulness, bringing consciousness into everything. It's sort of that awakening the inherent enchantment that is around us. It's been so hard. It's been so hard the past few years. So how do you balance, your sort of dedication to your spiritual work and what you're doing in the world with maintaining the physical needs in the world, with maintaining finding justice and things like that, because they seem to conflict so often lately. I don't know if I'm making any sense. It might be a jumble. Help.
Yeah, no, that's I love your definition for the great work, and I agree with everything you said for that. And I agree that it's been a tumultuous time on multiple levels and multiple ways. For me, the great work and balancing the great work, the keywords I keep going back to are those key teachings from the three rays of witchcraft. It's the will, it's the love, it's the wisdom, and wisdom balancing the love and the will. There's a time sometimes to act, and there's a time to hold space and hold compassion, and knowing which is when, is part of the wisdom of it. Because I think you can be very active and very focused on this is what I have to do, and sometimes you push forward so hard you don't realize the consequences you're having. And then other times you can choose not to act and just simply be present and sit with things and hold compassion, and you really should get up and do something. So the wisdom part is that kind of crooked path of going between those two sides and figuring out, well, what is the work before me in this moment? And I feel like over the last few years, I keep asking myself that question of something's going on, crisis, good, bad, indifferent, feelings hurt, feeling empowered, whatever it may be. Let's go back, take a breath. What is the work that is before me right now? Because it can be easy to go crazy and think, oh, I've got all this work to do on my personal level. I've got all this work in the world that's not happening, and the world's going crazy, and there's all these things we have to do. I try to avoid the consciousness of have to do, or if something is have to do, it's I have to do it. Because I think once we start getting into dictating what someone else has to do, outside of not harming other people and things like that. But when we get into specifics of that, I think we start to lose the occult thread, because I think it's not my place to tell anybody what their job is in the world, or what their will is in the world, or how they should manifest it. And it's that balance. What is before me right now? Sometimes before me is taking a breath and listening to somebody, because that's where I can do the greatest good and be in alignment with my purpose. And other times I need to create something, or other times I need to share it with people, and I have to deal with the mundanes that we have to deal with of, paying the bills or promoting an event. Like, you want an event to be successful, you think it's a really spiritual event, but if people don't know it's going to be there, they can't get the benefit of it. So you have to promote it, which these days can feel sometimes distasteful. I feel like everything's being promoted so much all the time. I'm always looking for that genuine voice of wisdom, but also realizing, like, I need someone to promote that voice of wisdom, because if I don't hear it, I'm not going to get to it either. So when I look at other people doing events and sharing rituals and sharing books and things like that, the how they do it, the posture of whether they're carrying virtue, in that process, or if it's just simply me, that kind of turns me off at things. So trying to be aware of that in these times. I think when we look at everything that's going on in the world, realizing that, we are one part of it, but we cannot force the lever individually to make great systematic changes. So what is that work before me right now? And are there local ways? Like, we often have grand ideas. So many of us focused, I won't get into the details of it, but we so focused on presidential election type stuff, but how many people were voting in their local school boards? So in the last couple of years, the big deal is I do not miss a vote. there's a vote in my town. I don't miss a vote. I'll do my best research for it. I'll look at the things that align with me and the recommendations they have. But I show up for those things because, my vote might not mean that much in the greater national thing. And I'm not saying don't vote by any stretch of the imagination, but, when I look at what is the issues my community is facing and who's showing up to make those decisions, can I be more present in that, even though it's exhausting? Like, every so often you have, some debate going on in your town or your state and having to write those letters. And, there's times I question, does that really help? How many letters have I written in the last 5-6 years? How many petitions have I signed? How much money have I donated? But I think it's better to assume with good faith that you're having some type of effect, even if it's just the energy of your consciousness. I've decided this is what I stand for and this is what the action that I'm going to take. And doing, what you can in the spaces that are around you. But I think it's very easy to get frustrated because we want to see big change immediately. I remember getting some feedback from somebody who went to the Women's March, and when we had all the Women's March, years ago, and sort of expected like that would take care of everything. And I was like, oh, that was just like the opening step, like that, was to make a presence known, and really feeling dejected that that did not work. And I'm like, oh, I think if you've been involved in other forms of activism before the recent years, you have a better sense of realizing how slowly things move. If you've done anything, I've had stuff in queer rights, I've had stuff in college. I was a little bit more involved in environmental rights, and I just had a point of, I don't think that's where my energy is best served. There's other people doing that better than me. What can I do? I can teach people how to quiet themselves. I can teach people how to do healing work. I can discuss, my experience as a queer man and queer rights. That's the things I do better. There's sort of advice at the beginning of all these recent difficulties of pick 3 things and focus on those 3 things, whatever it may be in the world, and don't think you have to do 10 things, because if you try to do 10 things, you'll do 10 things poorly. If you can do 3 things or even just do 1 thing, focus on that as your aspect. And if you can support other people, but make sure it's in alignment with your values.
I think that's reflected too in the way that a lot of people approach a magical practice as well. So I think it might be a little easier for people to recognize it in that sort of smaller scale. When you're focused in 100 different directions because you want to explore this and you want to explore this, it's just like when you want to help with this and you want to help with this and this. If every single thing is dear to your heart, but you're spreading yourself so thin that you're not being effective, and people do that with their magic too. They'll have 40 different spells going, but none of them are carrying really a whole lot of voltage because you're one person, when you have focused attention in one area, you can have a much bigger impact, and maybe that's your focus for a time, and then you switch your focus to somewhere else. But I think that's very difficult for everyone. I know it's difficult for me, so I'm just going to assume that it's difficult for everyone, because you want to help the puppies, and you want to help the children, and you want to help in Ukraine, and you want to do all of these different things. But yeah, we have been so scattered that we're losing. I feel like we're losing focused energy, and I think it's Byron Ballard that talks a lot about thinking globally and acting locally. Yeah. Those things do make a big impact, and those are things that are happening in your street and are happening in your community. And that's one of the ways that I sort of keep my sanity is I have to look at what my skills are. I don't have any education in environmentalism. I don't, so I'm not really going to be much help in that area. I can't speak about it. I can't push for things. I can help. I can, but not very much, but I can teach. I can teach healing. I can help people learn to communicate. I can help people learn ways to process their own stuff, and sort of raise that, I'm going to say vibration, but you know what I mean? That's kind of a broad term, but bring mindfulness and bring consciousness to individuals. I can make a big impact, in that way. And then they can go out and do their thing. I have students that are environmentalists, that are herbalists, that are, that work with, with women and victims of trauma and things like that. I can help them, and they can support them in their work. Right. And that's difficult because I want to support everybody. And it's not, you've got to focus on what you can do and do that well. And that's hard.
I agree. Absolutely.
So, and I think people aren't necessarily focused on the great work. I don't know. I don't even know how much it's talked about. We talk about it a lot in our tradition, but outside of that, I just don't. I just don't know. You know, there seems to be a shift in the last maybe 4 or 5 years of and I don't know what it is. I blame social media, but I might be an old lady inside. Um, there's a shift in the way people, like, I didn't have to teach so much about protection magic and stuff like that earlier on. But now it's like I'm constantly getting requests for protection, and people feel like they're being attacked. And I don't know how much of that is their own projections or just everybody's tense. I don't know. But there has been a shift in the consciousness of witchcraft culture. Have you noticed that?
Absolutely. I can speak a lot about that. I've given a lot of thought to that. I think, that's the blessing we often talk about. We live in the age of the great blessing and the great curse for multiple reasons, and for people who have not heard me talk about that before, or you haven't heard you talk about it, the idea that, never before have we had access to so much information. What a great blessing that is. We've got so much to go through, but like never before have we had access to so much information and we have no context for it. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a great curse, and talking about people taking, wherever their interests go and their practices and things like that. We have such information and availability and accessibility to practice and to experiment and to explore, which I think is great. But lacking that context, we don't understand how they all come together. 20 years ago, even more, 30, 40 years ago, but 20 years ago for me, even 10 years ago, depending on where you are, the context of what our communities have been doing were neo-pagan in a Western occultist tradition. There was a certain baseline. Even when we talk about it not having the rich culture we're looking for, there was a baseline culture. There was certain baseline etiquettes. There was certain baseline information and vocabulary that was fairly standard.
Mm-hmm.
And then as stuff has become more open, which I'm all for things being open, the definitions sort of become looser. The culture isn't transmitted because, I mean, there was a time before if you didn't know somebody in a coven, you probably wouldn't have direct training, and they were pretty cagey about telling anybody who they were in a coven. If
Mm-hmm.
you live near a major city, you might find an occult shop, and that occult shop might have a semi-public outer court group. And these were all very kind of specific traditions. I don't think they're for everybody, so I think it's great that there's so many of these other traditions out there. But I think the contexts often get lost. So, when I came into witchcraft and what I perpetuate through my teachings, because I think it's important, is the idea that we are part of a sacred priesthood. And it doesn't necessarily have a connection to the Stone Age, and it can be a modern priesthood or regenerated priesthood, but we're keepers of the holy. We're tenders of a sacred flame. Yes, we learn magic. Yes, we learn psychic powers. Yes, we can use them for benefit. Like, you should all have the food and money and things that you need and homes that you want, and magic can help you with that, and health and happiness. But you sort of hit that plateau of getting the things you need, and then it takes you deeper into the mysteries and deeper into service. And that was really one of the reasons why we did the temple, was to provide context and support for other areas of service, because not everybody wants to run a coven, or not everybody should run a coven. But I think in the process of being able to pick up a book on magic and not have that context, and just, a lot of the pop culture type views of magic, which I think can be fun, but are that, like, you can use it for yourself and there's no rules, and you can make it work however you want to make it work, and this is just for you. And even some of the books that are out there that are a little bit more kind of like spicy, as people talk about it, spicy pop psych. Like, if you're mad at somebody, you can do a curse to get rid of them in your life, because the author's not really thinking the curse is real. It's just like a way to make you feel better that you got your bad emotions out about that person. Yet you get somebody who has a bit of voltage behind them, that has a little bit of psychic ability, then they've done something pretty heavy. Um, and not having the context, I think it really started for me when we started to really kind of put down concepts like the Wiccan Rede and the Law of Three. And I think people have misunderstood them in a lot of ways. Like, a read is just good advice. If you don't want trouble, don't cause trouble. And so it wasn't as immutable law. People started to interpret it as this law, and you couldn't practice magic if you didn't do that. I knew a lot of traditional Gardnerians who cursed people, but when they did so, they felt that there was a need for it.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever the repercussions, the consequences of that would be, then they would deal with that. But there's that fine line, one person's curse is another person's sense of justice. And, what is the repercussions of that? But I think that sense of, when people started talking about the Wiccan Rede is made up and there's no consequence. It went very easy from that side to there's no consequences, there's no ethics, there's no morals. And you cannot follow the Wiccan Rede and have something before you reach to there's no consequences, there's no ethics, there's no morals. There's a lot of gray space in between there to figure out how you think things work. Even the law of return, people will talk about that as, oh, that's all made up, and that's very Christian, or that's very Eastern, that's very karmic. But even in Kabbalistic thought, even in a lot of kind of Western occultism, there's a sense of everything seeks to return to its source. So if you put something out there, the quality of what you put out is going to seek to return to its source in that process of energy. And I think that's a helpful principle to know, both for work that we're doing and our mystical views, because I left my source, so eventually I'm going to want to return to it. And that's part of the whole path of return. But I think people let going of a lot of that culture. Like we talked about the culture stuff before, there was a time when if you were a guest in someone's circle and you didn't have ritual robes, you would at least show up all in black. There'd be a certain demeanor. You would ask what the etiquette was. If you weren't clear, somebody would explain that etiquette. And now, it's like, oh, come as you are and however you want. Like I know when I go to a voodoo ceremony, if the invitation is wear all white and have a head covering, I wear all white and have a head covering. If I go to a Buddhist thing and they say don't eat beforehand, or that, they have different prescriptions of what you should and shouldn't do before attending, I follow all those. And I think in witchcraft, we've had such a, it's anything goes and you can do whatever you want and it's all good. We've let go of some of the traditions, and maybe because we didn't teach the whys as well as we could have. But I think at the same time, there were reasons for those things. And so I don't think we can ever go back. So I think we have to kind of go forward and figure out, well, what is the context that we're creating together? And I think, dissolve and coagulate. I think we're in one of those dissolve phases where everything's super messy. And I think we just have to embrace that it's messy and what's going to coagulate out of that and work with that. So I used to be really mad about it, and I'm not mad about it anymore, but I just try to be like, what is it that I'm trying to put forward? What do I think is helpful to people? I think people who read my articles that I put out through my website and the Temple of Witchcraft website, half of them are like, oh, it's a cranky old man talking again about, what it should be. And the other half are like, oh, thank you for putting words to that. That was really complex and nuanced. It just depends on what you're looking for. And I think there's a segment of people that are looking for the way that I'm hopefully helping to explain these things. And there's other people who this is not for them at the time. And maybe it will be later. Who knows?
It's interesting that you mentioned sort of dissolve and coagulate, because I think that's part of the process that people, they get to that part and then they stop, and maybe that's fine. That's as far as they need to go at that moment. Maybe they'll come back to it. I get that. But I think overall as a culture, it's having an effect beyond the individual. I think people get these little bite-sized chunks of wisdom, but as you mentioned, there's no context, there's no depth of experience that, when I read a meme, I have layers of context because I know where it comes from, or I've had that experience, or I've had that initiation, and it makes more sense. But on the surface, it still makes sense. But you're missing some depth and some context to it. And I think that's having an effect. I can't tell you how many people have come to, and this didn't happen before, but it's happened in the last year. People would come to rituals and things like that and say, the first thing out of their mouth is this is not how my coven does it. And I'm like, well, why did you come here? This isn't your coven, but they have that expectation that things are going to sort of morph around them to suit what they're expecting, to suit their expectations. Yes. And I think that people stop before they have to really examine and question their expectations. And before they go through the process of breaking down parts of themselves that they don't want to examine and things like that. How do you think that is going? I don't know. I'm probably just young and haven't been through these cycles in sort of the overculture that I've been through in myself. So it's probably just like you said, one of those breaking down moments. Maybe our entire culture as a whole is sort of having a disillusion moment, and then we'll come back together later on. But how do you, as a teacher, as someone who works with the public, how do you work through that so that you can maintain sort of that foundation, sort of that stable ground for people to come and go and eventually get to that part where we come back together. Or, I guess you have to look at maybe your structure also might have to break down and come together in different ways.
Absolutely. Astrology helps me a lot to realize there's always multiple cycles going on at any one time. So we can look at our personal cycles, we can look at our group cycles, we can look at our overall community or nation, and we can look at the world. And even when we think about that, like, I think the greater overarching experience we're having, if this is that age of Aquarius, the shift of the new age, the occultist will talk about how that's about a 300-year period of adjustment and everything sort of breaks down. So like there's what's going on individually for us, but then there's this overarching, global shift of the age, plus with what's going on in our country and all that. So things, different cycles, different currents kind of come together or coagulate and dissolve at different times, all simultaneously, and realizing that that's okay. Just like the most obvious one we can look at is there's a lunar cycle going in us every 28 days. And then there's also the solar cycle of that. And we can see those differences, but they're two different concurrent currents, but different cycles. I think in terms as a teacher, all you can do is really kind of create a container. You can offer what you offer in that container. You can give space for other things to happen in that container. And when things go difficultly, you have to manage that. And when things go beautifully, you admire that it goes beautifully, and you give support and thanks to the people who make that happen. But you have to kind of hold that context for it. And I think when you're talking about a timeless tradition, your own personal cycles and things might dissolve and coagulate, but there's certain foundation stones, there's certain pillars to it, and you kind of hold to those pillars, and you kind of build around that. When things break down, you use those pillars as the exoskeleton, of what the kind of structure of whatever you're building. But I think my experience of this day and these days and ages now is really kind of holding on to the idea of people are going to come and go. You can't take it personally. The idea that you're going to make space for these different things, but you don't have to be all things to all people.
That's a big thing.
It's a hard one because when you want to do all the things and support all the people,
Mm-hmm.
the natural step is to have to be all things to all people, and you really can't. It's again going back to that idea of what can I do well, what am I qualified to do, what can I support in, can I support something else, and if I can't support it, do I need to separate from it? Does that need to be something separate for them? And that's a tough space to be in, because I think when we think community, we think it is inclusive of everyone and everything everywhere and all times. But I'm not making space for someone who wants to do a Bible study in the Temple of Witchcraft. Yet if someone wants to talk about how their experience as a Christian has experienced their gnosis of witchcraft, we've had people talk about that, and those have been great classes. So it's like, where is that line of my work is not to support a biblical study, but I always want to hear people's experiences and how that deepens their witchcraft. But some people might look through those two things and say, oh, it's the same thing. You shouldn't be doing that, or you should be doing that. And, all we can do is determine that for ourselves and what we can support for ourselves. But I think it's holding that structure and letting people kind of come and go as they need to, not having to solve everyone's problem, not having to fix everyone's problem, not having to be everyone's answer. I think it's a huge part that I've learned, although I still struggle with it.
That's a tough one, especially if you're in a smaller community. And I think witchcraft in general is a smaller community. But even within that, if you're dealing with 10 or 20 people and you're dealing with a small area, you have the desire to provide everything you can for everyone. But you can't. You have to know what your thread is that you're holding, and where that leads is okay, and it probably will change and evolve over time, but you have to hold on to your thread. And that's hard because people don't want to feel I don't want to say rejected, but rejected. They don't want to feel ostracized, and sometimes it's like, that's not what's happening here, but what you're wanting is not what I'm offering, and so maybe that's for you to create.
Absolutely. That's a key part. And even if they can't create it, what work are you willing to do for it? I do feel like the ease of access of information has made a lot of people feel like, going back to that idea of being spoon-fed, like, what are you going to give me to solve this problem? And if someone comes to me and says, I had a problem with X, I looked this up, can you explain this to me? That's very different than someone saying, I had a problem with X and I want you to fix it.
Or just stop talking. They just present you their problem, and then they're just waiting for you to offer to fix it.
Yep. Yeah.
Yes, bless
Yes.
it.
I think seeing the level of engagement, I've often made the mistake in the past of feeling that if someone has not engaged, then they don't know how, and they just needed that help for it. And that hasn't always been the case for me. I've found that, often people have not engaged hasn't been because they don't know how, it's because they don't want to. So I'll teach the first time, like, well, I would look this up, and when you find stuff, let me know. We can have another conversation. And either they go away and come back, or they go away and don't come back. And if they come back and they're just like, oh, I still have this problem and I didn't do anything you recommended, then I can't help, So it's figuring out the level of engagement somebody can put into it, because you can't care more or put more energy into solving their problems than they're doing.
And that's, to turn that around from the perspective of learning and pursuing your practice, you have to put that effort in. That ease of information of being able to do a Google search or buy a book on whatever the topic is. You actually have to put your practice into practice.
Right.
And there's not ever going to be someone who can hold your hand the whole way, because your path is different. You are on a different thread than everyone else, so you have to experience those things yourself. And people stop. They will stop if they get to a place where someone's not there to answer their questions. And that's kind of the scary part, where you have to sort of jump. But I hope, and I encourage people, particularly newer practitioners or practitioners who don't have a community to sort of hold that space of transformation, which I encourage you to find a community. But also, you have to just keep going. You have to take those leaps that may be leaps of faith, as it were. I might have a different definition of faith than other people, but you have to keep pushing through,
Yeah,
so
one of the great points of initiation, right? Like, no one can go into an initiation with you. They can hold space for it. They can facilitate the process, but in the end, it's you with the spirits. No one can do your great work, and if they try, far better to do my own great work imperfectly than try to do your great work perfectly.
Exactly. I'm going to write that down. I've heard you say that before, but I didn't write it down. I'm just going to stick it on the wall.
It's usually a concept taken from the Dharma tradition. So it's better to do your Dharma imperfectly than, to do someone else's Dharma perfectly. So just same idea of great work for us, but you need to balance that out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. So what is, we kind of got off on a rabbit trail, so I'm going to bring us back to my list. So what projects do you have that are in the works right now that you want to share with people?
Yeah, I have quite a few things that are in various stages, which we've just been so busy with the temple and things that are going on in the world and everything. I feel like if something suffers in my life, it's the production of my books, because that's all on me, and I have less expectations. Not that it's all on me, it's my partners and I, but I feel like sometimes Copper Cauldron can take a back seat to what's going on in the temple, which is, it's lovely that I can do that and I have the freedom to do that. And having Llewellyn have hard deadlines for me right now has kind of been the priority of stuff. But for Copper Cauldron, for projects, I've got a book called The Goddess in the Cauldron. So it's relating a lot to the mysteries of Caradon, which I know you know because you did the lovely cover for it, and it will come out someday. I trust.
I believe you. It's a good book.
It's all about the mysteries of particularly Caradon, but other goddesses related to the Holy Grail mysteries and the fairy races, and really takes kind of an alchemical occultist view of the mysteries of the cauldron, which I think right now a lot of things that are popular are more of the Reconstructionist kind of Welsh mythology history, and it's not that. So if that's what you're looking for, that's not what I did. But I'm very excited about it because of that occultism and really the cauldron is the witch's tool. I've got another book called Sabbatic Visions, and that is a little bit more of an academic book, but definitely also a how-to practical book. It looks at the Wheel of the Year through the lens of Christian folk and saint traditions, and how some paganism got lent into that, and how witches might be able to kind of take it back.
Now, you did some class series on that. I've taken a few of those. Is that
it's based on the whole series? Yeah, actually, we had somebody transcribe the series, and then I used that as the skeleton and filled out all the academic stuff in between. And so I'm very excited about that. In fact, I just talked to the cover artist that might be doing that, and they sent me preliminary sketches. So I'm very excited about that.
Well, that's exciting. I'm excited about that.
It's a very heretical view of the Wheel of the Year. I think people, people love it will love it. I think people hate it will hate it. But It's very much, kind of looking at some of the traditional, both, pagan holidays that became Christian holidays, and then that deeper cultural mysticism. And does that have something to say to us as witches today? And I think for a lot of people, the answer will be no. But for those of us who want to kind of look at the weirdness of it all, and, what are the ideas behind All Saints Day and All Souls Day? Kind of looking at the myth of Befana and, the adoration of the Magi and the, Epiphany, and does that relate something to our Yule mysteries? Looking at Lupercalia and how it became St. Valentine's Day. And strangely, the one that was my favorite, and it seems crazy but appropriate for when we're recording this, even this is not coming out to the summer, is it's just before Easter weekend. And so really looking at the myths of the sacrificed god and the lunar associations that are so deeply goddess reverent in Easter, and really teasing those out of what they might mean to a witch and what they might mean to, a practitioner of the mysteries of whatever those mysteries might be. So I really got deep into like the stations of the cross and the crucifixion and different crucified and sacrificed gods and how they relate to it, particularly Osiris. So I think it was very healing for me as a former Catholic to kind of look at a lot of that stuff and look at some of the weirdness that my Italian Catholic family did for folk traditions, and to, they were very big about the Assumption of Mary, and I related that to Lammas and the Feast of Hecate and that whole time of year. And seeing my childhood through different eyes has been helpful.
That's exciting. I can't wait to read that. And we don't have the Catholic lens here. We have Southern Baptist, which is a different situation. But that's very interesting. That kind of makes me want to take those ideas and sort of deconstruct them a little bit. Yay. I can't wait for that. I'm excited. So what is the next big project? Like, maybe you're not already working on it. Maybe you are. The big thing. What is it?
I think the big kind of educational project that I'm pretty excited about, and in fact, I just finished the first draft of the last lesson today, is something called The Pillars of the Witch's Temple.
You have my attention.
And one of the things that I found through these difficult, challenging times, so for people who might study with you or might study on the online mystery school in the temple, or any class that I take that's, a degreed class that I teach in the Temple of Witchcraft, there's homework. And there's accountability, and there's, it's not a go at your own pace, and it's not your do your own thing type of experience. And that's very purposeful, and I have lots of classes that are show up and just experience it, or go at your own pace and do what you want. But the hard part has been during these times of COVID and the other traumas that we've been experiencing for years is people are overwhelmed. People are very tired. People, want the mysteries and want to belong and want to experience things, but then often feel like if they can't because of health and job and family and all that's going on, that somehow, and you mentioned this earlier, they feel rejected. And that's been the biggest thing of trying to navigate. And some of my writing has been about, just because you didn't finish a class doesn't mean you're rejected as a person. Or just because you weren't accepted to go further on the class and we think you need more time with the material and let it settle, doesn't mean we think you're a bad person and you shouldn't go on or you'll never go on. But we've had a lot of hard conversations trying to explain that. And that can be hard to hear because people want what they want when they want it. And I get that. We're all that way, So we decided this year to try to address that. So we created a 20-lesson class that's going to be done on video, that is purposely for distant people who'd like to be involved, and it's set at your own pace. And so it's basically the tradition of the Temple of Witchcraft, at least the foundation for it, the culture of the Temple of Witchcraft, if you'd like to get more involved in the community, without the pressure of having to get homework in and get feedback and to be done at a particular time. So it uses the image of the ancient temples of Egypt and Greece and Rome, and each lesson is based on a spot in the temple. And the idea is once you enter it, you can spend as much time in that chamber as you'd like. You can go back to the previous ones. When you finish that chamber's work, and you decide you're finished with it, you can then get the next lesson. And what we want to do is to offer that as an alternative for people who might want to take Witchcraft 1 or any of the Witchcrafts, because it draws a material from all 5 levels. So it's not just beginner, but it starts out with the assumption, hey, you might not know anything about witchcraft. And even if you do, hey, you might not know anything about the temple. Here's how we do it. But it's very open. It draws upon a lot of my writings. It draws upon some of Laurie Cabot's writings that I want to share that kind of foundation I had. Has lots of recipes and formulas and meditations, about 50 exercises in it. And it was really built in that way. So if someone, is thinking about taking Witchcraft 1, but they're nervous about the homework, well, start with this and see how it goes. Or if you start to take Witchcraft 1 or any of the Witchcraft levels and it's not working out for you, and you tell us that, we would like to offer you this class in exchange because it's the same price as the levels. So if you want to just easily switch out of Witchcraft 1 and take Pillars of the Witch's Temple, you can do that. And you're still part of the community and you're still welcomed and you can still learn about it, but you have none of the pressure to go forward. It doesn't confer a degree. So if you wanted to go forward in the degree program, you still need to take that, but it does confer membership in the community.
That is so wonderful. I can't tell you how excited I am about this because, of course, especially over the last 2 years, we've had a lot of people that are completely, utterly overwhelmed, and remove themselves from class situations when, from the outside, it's kind of like, I've been there. If you were able to do your work, it would help.
Right.
But that's wonderful because that gives them an opportunity to do something that's not as much pressure. And I swear I spend half my life trying to explain the culture of Temple of Witchcraft to people who are coming from coven structures and coming from things like that. And it seems totally foreign to them.
Right.
It makes sense to me, but I'm so glad you're doing this. Yay. Wonderful. When is that going to be ready? I need to write that down.
So we're opening up the mystery school teachings this year in September. So my hope is to have this class ready to go October 1st.
Yes. And so for distance people, they would just take the class online.
Yep.
So
and if you're in a class with me and it's not working out, we can just offer this to you as another option. So there's no shame about it. There's no difficulties of whatever's going on in your life. And a lot of people have had really serious medical things or taking care of family stuff. And I get, you may even be doing the practice and can't write up the homework, and I get that. So if you want to continue to do your practice and not have to write up the homework and get new lessons, this is a great way to do it that doesn't put any stress on us, doesn't put any stress on them. And, and if it goes well, my idea is I actually have outlined 2 other levels for it. So if there's enough interest in it, I'll do 2 other courses that are like this, and sort of have that as an optional way for people who might want to join the advanced classes that are the Society of the Temple. So you'd have all the philosophy if you've completed those 3 levels and might want to take, the different Ray classes and the Merkaba classes that we have out there. So it's a story for another time, but that's, an exciting way to kind of have an entry point for people. Because, at this point, if I wanted to study something else, would I want to go through all the homework and would I want to do everything? And I get the reasons too and the benefit for it. And I've studied with teachers where I've had to submit things. But, it might be nice. I'm enjoying a lot of classes that I'm just taking online that I just get to take the class and enjoy it and do it the way I want to do it and then move on to the next thing. So I wanted to give that option in the temple structure and culture for people who are in a different place.
I'm glad you're doing that. And I think you're right. I think actually being accountable and having direct feedback is important. I think that is important. I think everybody needs to have that at some point in their practice, but not, they may have had that in a different way before, right. But thank you. I'm glad. I like that. I'm excited about that. We'll talk about that more, not on this show. Yay. Okay. So, there's one thing that was mentioned in the new edition of the Inner Temple, and that is the key to the Temple of Witchcraft. Would you like to share any information about that?
Sure. So that was my my little primer I talked about from some of the cultural stuff. So I promised Llewellyn, well, I didn't promise, but we had a conversation if all goes well, because, publishing's ups and downs. But if all goes well with the reprints of the 6 books, that we would do a 7th book, which I had promised quite a while ago. And things shifted at Llewellyn and staff changed and it just didn't kind of work out. And I started focusing on the temple and Copper Cauldron. And originally that was supposed to be the Book of Shadows at that time. And now the Book of Shadows is just so vast.
Right.
What I want to do is do a book that's like a primer of cultural points to the temple. So it's not the whole Book of Shadows, but it's like, and I'm working on some material that, we might not have seen in the temple that complements it. Like we've got these amazing mandalas to the chakras. And they're not Hindu mandalas, but they're definitely Western occult mandalas using Theban and the Cipher of the Angels and looking at the alchemical correspondences and using that as a part of, some of the cultural aspects of it. And using for people who are familiar, there's a paten in the temple that's the symbol of the temple, and kind of explaining what that is to people who might see it. And sort of kind of giving a primer through the 5 levels of here's some cultural ideas from the temple. Here's some information about the 9 mothers. Here's some information about the witch soul. Here's some information about the 3 rays. and not be a full course, but just be if you have the 6 books and you want to know a little bit more about, what do we do in the community of the Temple of Witchcraft, this would give you some of the myths, some of the culture, things like our Lorica breastplate prayer, and not only what is it, but what are the symbols in it, and what does that mean for part of the culture. And that might be a way of people saying, oh, this really resonates with me, I want to learn more about this, or oh, these are interesting ideas, I'm going to use them to inspire my own thing. And either way, I think that serves.
Well, I'm excited about that. Excellent. It's difficult sometimes from sort of when you're in the thing, it all makes sense, but when you're dealing with people who are coming in, it all seems very disjointed, or they can't really see how it all fits together. So hopefully that will help answer some of those questions. I'm excited about that. I'm excited about a lot of things. I love talking to you because you have so many things going all at the same time. I hope you get plenty of sleep, but I don't think you do.
You're right.
Oh, well, and I'm going to be coming up to see you at the beginning of May. By the time this episode comes out, I will have already seen you.
Right.
But yeah, so hopefully we can have some lovely chats, and I'll get to visit New Hampshire. I haven't been up there since 2019, which seems like a million years ago. Yeah. So I want to see a lot of people. So, by the time the show comes out, I'll have already seen them all. Anyway. Okay. So where can our listeners find you? If they're interested for more information about the Temple of Witchcraft or your own work, where should they go?
So for the temple, our website is templeofwitchcraft.org. And we have all the social medias out there, or not all of them, but most of them. And for me, it's just christopherpenczak.com.
Well, that is easy to remember. And we will put links to everything in the show notes, and check out the new editions of the Inner Temple of Witchcraft. If you have already read the Inner Temple of Witchcraft, even if you've read it repeatedly, I encourage you to get the new edition, because there is a lot of insight in there that is quite valuable. So please go buy the Inner Temple again. And look, Christopher, on a personal note, talk to Llewellyn about MP3s of the recordings, please.
That has been a constant. We can talk more about that when it's just you and I.
Okay, we'll talk about that later. But
so, I'd hope they would be out by now, but they've not. So feel free for all of your listeners to write Llewellyn directly and go to their website and say,
I will. I'm gonna write Llewellyn. I'm gonna call Llewellyn because yes, we need those. Those are wonderful. Thank you, Christopher. It's been a delight chatting with you, and I do hope you will come back again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to our visit. And this was an awesome chat. Thank you for having me.
Yay. Okay, everyone. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. Blessed be.
Blessed be.
Thank you all so much for listening, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe through your favorite podcast provider. It helps us get our podcast in front of more listeners just like you. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can leave us a voicemail by clicking the link in the description of this episode, and you can always find us on Facebook and Instagram by searching for Crossroads and Cauldrons Podcast.